The P-51 Mustang backthrower that had become a liquid fire, its aluminum frame shattering as thermal columns rising from Tokyo turned the atmosphere into a living thing that fought against my controls. Below me, the city's familiar skyline was dissolving into something impossible to process, entire districts glowing red like coals in a blacksmith's forge, firestorms forming tear-down weather systems that reached up toward my aircraft with invisible hands of superated air. Smoke columns rose miles into the sky, black pillars that seemed to support a ceiling of stars I could no longer see. The silence was the worst part. At 15,000 feet, the destruction below unfolded without sound, a nightmare ballet of light and shadow that my mind couldn't reconcile with the maps either studied or the city either imagined. Shockwaves of it made the Mustang's engine cough and stutter, reminding me that it was flying through the breast of an urban inferno that stretched to every horizon. Nothing in training had explained this feeling, the weight of witnessing something so vast and terrible that words became inadequate, useless, impossible. I wasn't prepared for the moral vertigo that comes from watching civilization dissolve into elements of fear, smoke, and glowing gas. After that night, I was never able to speak about it again. If you're here to hear this story, stay with me until the end. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because these memories need witnesses even when the man who carries them cannot find his voice. To understand why that night shattered something inside me that could never be repaired, we need to go back to a farm in Kansas where flying was still pure magic, before I learned that angels could carry fear. I was born in 1922 on wet land that stretched to every horizon, where the biggest excitement was watching barnstormers perform at county fairs and dreaming of the day I might sleep the early bones of earth. My father farmed 300 acres with methodical precision, rising before dawn to work land that his father had worked, following rhythms as predictable as sunrise. We lived in a white farmhouse with green shutters, surrounded by fields that changed color with the seasons, green in spring, gold in summer, brown in autumn when the wheat was harvested and the stubble waited for winter snow. But I lived for the moments when aircraft passed overhead, usually mail planes following routes between Kansas City and Denver, or occasional military trainers from the airfield near Wichita. Their engines would announce their approach long before they appeared, a distant rumble that grew into a roar that seemed to fill the entire sky. Either run from whatever shore I was doing to watch them pass, silver ships writing temporary poems across Kansas sky. The first time I showed a photograph of a P-51 Mustang, I was 16 and working behind the counter at Henderson's General Store. A pilot magazine had arrived with the mail, and there on the cover was the most beautiful machine I'd ever seen. The Mustang's line seemed to suggest speed even while sitting motionless on a runway, its silver skin polished to mirror brightness, canopy shaped like a teardrop that had been stretched by wind. Everything about the aircraft suggested grace, power, the possibility of touching something beyond ordinary human experience. My uncle had flown with the Lafayette Escadrille in the First War, and his stories filled my childhood with images of aerial combat as something noble, almost chivalrous. Knights of the air, I called them, fighting individual duels above the trenches where honor still meant something. War, in his telling, was about skill and courage and young men proving themselves worthy of the sky. That, when it came cleanly, a machine falling at the wrong moment, a pilot's error in judgment, an enemy superior marksmanship in a fair fight. Nothing in his romantic narratives prepared me for what war would become by 1945, when individual heroism would be absorbed into massive technological operations that reduced human agency to small parts in enormous machines. He enlisted 2 days after Pearl Harbor, driven by the summer age's anger that motivated thousands of young Americans who understood that fascism threatened everything we believed about freedom and human dignity. Flight training began in Texas, where he learned that flying a P-51 was like wearing a perfectly fitted suit designed by angels who understood both physics and beauty. The P-51 S. Merlin engine produced 1,490 horsepower, enough to pull the aircraft through the air at speeds approaching 450 miles per hour. But the Mustang's designers had created something that responded to pilot input with precision that seemed almost telepathic. The controls were so perfectly balanced that experienced pilots could make the aircraft dance, performing maneuvers that looked like poetry written against the sky. In the cockpit, surrounded by instruments that glowed green in the darkness, I felt connected to something larger than myself, part of a machine that could travel at speeds that made the ground below blur into abstract patterns of color and light. The engine sound was constant, reassuring, a mechanical heartbeat that promised reliable power for whatever missions lay ahead. Squadron life created bonds deeper than family, forged by shared danger and mutual dependence that made every mission a test of collective trust. We flew formation so tight that wingtips sometimes seemed close enough to touch. Each pilot responsible for the safety of men whose lives depended on precision measured in feet and seconds. Bill Morrison from Oregon, who could put a Mustang through aerobatics that seemed to defy gravity. Jack Sullivan from New York, who'd grown up in poverty but flew like he'd been born with wings. Tommy Chen from California, whose parents had been interned while they fought for the country that had imprisoned them. Early missions over Germany felt like extensions of training, escort duty for bomber formations, occasional dogfights with German fighters that tested our skills against enemy pilots who were skilled but increasingly outnumbered. The war in Europe had rules that made sense, objectives that seemed clear, enemies who wore uniforms and flew aircraft we could identify and respect as worthy opponents. Even when friends died, their deaths felt connected to recognizable military purposes. We were fighting to destroy Nazi war production, to protect bomber crews, to establish air superiority that would shorten the conflict and save lives by making invasion of Europe possible. Individual combat had meaning within larger strategic goals that seemed clearly justified by the nature of our enemies and the importance of defeating fascism. The mission briefing that changed everything came in early 1945, after we'd been transferred to the Pacific Theater. Our commanding officer, Colonel Patterson, stood before maps of Tokyo that showed population density, industrial areas, and what they called fire risk potential. The language was clinical, bureaucratic, designed to distance us from the reality of what we were about to participate in. Strategic area bombardment, called it. Acceleration of war termination through economic disruption. But the maps told a different story. Tokyo wasn't a collection of military targets, it was a city where millions of people lived in wooden houses that had been built according to architectural traditions stretching back centuries. The fire risk potential discussed wasn't about destroying factories. It was about creating an inferno that would consume everything combustible in a metropolitan area larger than any American city. Lieutenant Carter raised his hand tentatively. Sir, what about civilian evacuation? The question hung in the air like smoke. Colonel Patterson's expression hardened. Lieutenant, civilian evacuation is not your concern. Your mission is escort duty for the bombers carrying out strategic objectives. The answer was technically correct and morally insufficient, and everyone in that briefing room understood the gap between official language and actual reality. The flight to Tokyo took place in darkness that seemed to absorb our engine noise and leave us suspended in silence above the Pacific Ocean that stretched endlessly in every direction. The formation was massive, hundreds of B-29 superfortresses carrying incendiary bombs designed to turn urban areas into furnaces, escorted by dozens of P-51 whose job was to ensure the bombers reached their targets unopposed by Japanese fighters that had become increasingly rare as fuel shortages and pilot losses reduced their air force to desperate last stands. From my cockpit, I could see navigation lights stretching to every horizon, each one representing 10 men and several tons of fire that would soon be falling on a city where millions of people lived in wooden houses that had been built according to architectural traditions stretching back centuries. The scale of the operation was unprecedented, more bombers than had ever been assembled for a single mission in the Pacific Theater, carrying enough incendiary materials to create firestorms that could consume entire metropolitan areas. The Pacific at night was a black void that seemed to swallow light and sound, broken only by occasional beatcaps that caught starlit and disappeared into darkness that had no visible bottom. Flying over water at night required constant attention to instruments, since visual references disappeared completely and spatial disorientation could develop within seconds if a pilot trusted his inner ear rather than his gauges. The P-51 engine maintained its steady rhythm, but the sound seemed smaller, more fragile against the immensity of ocean that surrounded us. Hours into the flight, conversation on the radio decreased from operational chatter to essential communications only. Each pilot was processing the approaching mission in his own way, dealing with knowledge that our escort duty would take us over a burning city where the difference between military targets and civilian neighborhoods would disappear in firestorms too intense for human comprehension. The moral weight of strategic bombing had been discussed in briefings using clinical language that distanced us from emotional reality, but thousands of feet above the Pacific, technical terminology couldn't mask what we were about to witness. The first glow appeared on the horizon like a false dawn, a dim orange radiance that grew brighter as we approached the Japanese coast. At first, I thought it might be sunrise, but the light was coming from the wrong direction, pulsing with an intensity that natural light don't possess and changing colors in ways that suggested massive fires rather than solar illumination. It was Tokyo burning, visible from 100 miles away, a beacon that announced the success of the mission before we even reached our assigned positions over the target area. The glow grew brighter as we approached, resolving into individual columns of smoke and flame that rose so they seemed to support the sky itself. Radio chatter stopped completely as pilots processed what they were seeing, destruction on a scale that made the previous bombing missions look like training exercises. The B-51 ahead of us continued dropping their loads with mechanical precision, adding new fires to existing fires until the distinction between separate blazes disappeared into a single conflagration that covered hundreds of square miles. The approach to the target area took us through smoke that rose so it obscured the stars, thermal columns that made the formation flying nearly impossible, air that had been separated by fires burning across territory larger than most American states. The P-51 shattered through turbulence created by temperature differentials between burning city and Pacific air, its engine occasionally missing beats as oxygen content changed without warning and atmospheric pressure fluctuated in response to convection currents rising from the inferno below. My aircraft's instruments showed conditions that were outside the normal parameters, outside their temperature readings that fluctuated between extremes, compass readings that swung wildly as magnetic fields were distorted by electromagnetic effects from the massive fires, radio static that made the communication with other aircraft difficult or impossible. The Mustang was flying through an atmosphere that had been transformed by destruction, air that had been poisoned by smoke and separated by flames until it could barely support combustion in aircraft engines designed for normal atmospheric conditions. Then we flew directly over the inferno, and my understanding of war, morality, and my own identity collapsed in the space of heartbeats. Tokyo was vanishing beneath us in ways that defied comprehension. Entire districts had become single flames that stretched from horizon to horizon, wooden structures igniting so rapidly that individual buildings couldn't be distinguished from the firestorm that consumed them. Air rising from the burning city created its own weather system, winds that spread destruction faster than any firefighting equipment could respond, convection currents that lifted burning debris miles into the air where it fell like rain on areas that hadn't yet caught fire. The scale overwhelmed every frame of reference I possessed for understanding destruction. This wasn't a combat between military forces, it was the elimination of a city through applied physics, chemistry transformed into warfare that consumed everything organic within its reach. Streets glowed red like metal in a fog. Rivers reflected firelight until they seemed to be made of molten copper. Smoke columns rose so they disappeared into darkness above our flight ceiling. From my cockpit, I could see the geometric patterns of city blocks dissolving into chaos as fires jumped from building to building faster than human movement could escape. Parks that had been green spaces became temporary islands in seas of flame, then disappeared as separated or ignited grass and trees that had seemed safely distant from wood and residential areas. Industrial districts merged with residential neighborhoods in a conflagration that made no distinction between military targets and civilian infrastructure. The P-51 shattered through thermal turbulence that threatened to tear the aircraft apart, its aluminum frame groaning under stresses that exceeded the design specifications. Engine temperature gauges climbed toward red lines as the aircraft struggled to process air that had been separated by fires burning across hundreds of square miles. Radio communication became impossible as electromagnetic effects from the massive fires created static that drowned out attempts at coordination between aircraft. If this moment resonates with you, leave a comment. Your support keeps these memories alive. My hands trembled on the controls as I tried to process what was happening below. The moral weight of witnessing such destruction, regardless of its strategic justification, created a physical sensation in my chest that made breathing difficult. I became complicit in something that felt fundamentally wrong, even if it was militarily necessary, even if it might shorten the war and save American lives by avoiding invasion. The silence on the radio told me other pilots were experiencing the same psychological fracturing. Men who had flown dozens of missions over Germany without hesitation were struck speechless by the scale of what was unfolding below us. The firestorm had created its own logic, its own momentum that seemed independent of the bombers that had started it. We were watching a city die, and no amount of strategic rationale could make that feel acceptable. Through my aircraft's canopy, I could see other P-51s maintaining formation with mechanical precision while their pilots struggled to process what they were witnessing. Some aircraft seemed to hesitate, as if their pilots were considering breaking formation to escape what they were being forced to observe. Others flew with the rigid precision that comes from shock, their pilots probably experiencing the same emotional shutdown that was affecting my ability to think clearly. The destruction below us had achieved a momentum that seemed to exceed human agency. Individual bombs had created individual fires, but the fires had merged into something larger than the sum of their parts, a conflagration that generated its own weather patterns and followed its own logic rather than responding to human intention or control. We helped start something that had become independent of our actions, a force of nature that we could observe but no longer influence or stop. Time seemed suspended as we flew over the burning city, minutes stretching into hours as my mind struggled to process visual information that exceeded normal categories of experience. The fires below us weren't just destroying buildings, they were eliminating the infrastructure of an entire metropolitan area, erasing neighborhoods that had existed for centuries, consuming cultural landmarks and ordinary residences with equal efficiency. Banking away from the target area, I could see the full scope of the destruction spreading beyond the horizon in every direction. The firestorm covered territory larger than any American city, a sea of flame that had consumed everything combustible within its reach and was continuing to expand as winds carried burning debris to areas that hadn't yet been directly targeted. What we participated in wasn't strategic bombing, it was the elimination of a city through the application of scientific principles that transformed urban areas into furnaces. The return flight passed in dead silence that extended beyond radio protocol into something deeper and more disturbing. None of us wanted to put into words what we witnessed, as if speaking about it might make us more responsible than we already were. The P-51 flew itself home while I stared at my hands and wondered how they'd become instruments in something I couldn't reconcile with the person I'd been that morning. Formation discipline held but barely. Each aircraft maintained its assigned position through mechanical precision rather than conscious control, pilots following procedures that had been drilled into muscle memory while their conscious minds struggled to process what they'd seen. Radio silence wasn't ordered, it emerged naturally from the shared understanding that language had become inadequate for describing what we'd participated in. The flight back across the Pacific took on a surreal quality, as if we were traveling between two different worlds. Behind us, Tokyo burned with fires that would be visible for hundreds of miles, smoke columns that would mark the destruction for days to come. Ahead of us lay our base, briefing rooms, mess halls, sleeping quarters that represented normal military life where actions could be evaluated according to standard concepts of duty, strategy, and national purpose. But the distance between those two worlds wasn't measured in miles or flight time. It was measured in moral complexity that couldn't be bridged through rationalization or military doctrine. We'd left the base that morning as combat pilots following orders that made sense within established frameworks for understanding warfare. We were returning as men who'd participated in something that exceeded those frameworks, something that would require new categories of thought to process or understand. My hands moved the controls automatically, maintaining airspeed and altitude through responses that had been conditioned by thousands of hours of flight time. But my mind was elsewhere, replaying images of the burning city and trying to understand how strategic necessity had led to destruction on a scale that seemed to belong in mythology rather than military history. The P-51's engine maintained its steady rhythm, but the sound seemed different now, tainted by association with what we'd accomplished. Looking across the formation at other aircraft, I could see pilots sitting motionless in their cockpits, probably experiencing the same emotional numbness that was affecting my ability to think clearly. These were men who'd flown combat missions over Europe, who'd engaged enemy fighters in aerial combat, who'd watched friends die in circumstances that felt heroic even when they were tragic. But none of our previous experience had prepared us for participating in the systematic destruction of an entire metropolitan area. The moral weight of what we'd witnessed was different from combat casualties or even the civilian deaths that inevitably accompany the strategic bombing of military targets. Those deaths felt tragic but comprehensible within frameworks that distinguished between acceptable and unacceptable warfare. What we'd seen over Tokyo exceeded those boundaries, crossed into territory that traditional concepts of military necessity couldn't adequately address or justify. As the Japanese coastline disappeared behind us, I realized that something fundamental had changed inside me that could never be reversed. The idealism that had motivated my enlistment, the sense of purpose that had sustained me through training and combat, the belief that individual actions could make a meaningful difference in struggles between good and evil, all of it had been consumed in the fires we'd helped create. I was returning to base as a different person, carrying knowledge that would isolate me from everyone who hadn't shared the experience of watching a city burn. Back at base, the debriefing focused exclusively on technical details that could be recorded in official reports: fuel consumption rates, mechanical problems, enemy fighter activity. No one asked about the emotional impact of watching a city burn from horizon to horizon. Officers recorded statistics in logbooks that would become a part of the historical record, but they avoided any discussion of how the mission affected the men who had flown it. The silence felt institutional, carefully maintained, as if the psychological cost of strategic bombing was considered irrelevant to military effectiveness or too dangerous to acknowledge openly. We have been trained to compartmentalize, to separate operational requirements from emotional responses, but the compartments were breaking down under pressure that exceeded their design specifications. That night, sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tokyo burning, not the clinical, distant view from 15,000 feet, but imaginative reconstructions of what the fires must have looked like from ground level. The nightmares began immediately and continued for decades, growing more detailed and emotionally devastating as time passed rather than fading into manageable memory. I never spoke about what I'd seen, not to my wife when I returned home, not to my children when they asked about my military service, not to the veterans who gathered at American Legion meetings to share stories about campaigns they survived. The words didn't exist to describe the weight of watching a city vanish into fear, the moral complexity of knowing that your actions were both strategically necessary and personally devastating. Marriage should have provided emotional refuge, but how do you explain to someone you love that you carry images of destruction so vast that normal human experience has no frame of reference for understanding them? My wife knew that something had happened during the war that I couldn't discuss, but she interpreted my silence as typical male reluctance to share emotional vulnerability. The silence cost me relationships, emotional connections, the ability to feel pride in military service that had included moments of genuine heroism alongside participation in something that felt fundamentally wrong. I carried the weight of that night over Tokyo through every day that followed, a burden that grew heavier with age rather than lighter as the distance between past and present increased. I'm breaking the silence now because those of us who witnessed the true nature of modern warfare are dying, taking our memories with us into graves that will never reveal the full psychological cost of victory. The strategic bombing campaigns ended the war more quickly than invasion would have, probably saved millions of lives on both sides, achieved objectives that seemed impossible through conventional military means. But they also destroyed something inside the men who carried them out, forced us to confront the reality that moral complexity don't disappear just because military necessity demands impossible choices. We become instruments of destruction so vast that individual conscience become irrelevant, absorbed into larger historical forces that reduce human agency to small pieces of an enormous machine. If you want more stories from those who witnessed the war from the sky, stories that honor both the necessity of victory and the cost of achieving it, subscribe. These memories deserve to survive even when they are too heavy for the men who carry them. Some cities burn once. Others burn inside you forever.